Well, first of all, welcome everyone to this seminar on regionalisation and decarbonisation. I'm Harriet Babajan at James Cook University, the Cairns Institute, and I'm also the chair of the Regional Development Australia for Tropical North, and I'm your MC for today. We have some wonderful speakers. I would like to open the forum by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands and waters in which we meet. We're all in different places, so pay our respects to elders and traditional owners, past, present and emerging. I'm in Irukandji Jabukai, and we've got 19 rainforest Aboriginal clans around us where we are. So welcome, thank you very much. We will be recording this session. A number of people who were coming said, please record it. So if anyone doesn't have great objections, we will hit the record button and record the event so that people can listen to it afterwards for those who have not been able to make it. Hopefully that's okay with everyone. John, you have your hand up. Did you want to say something before we start, John Rolfe? No? Okay. So in that case, without further ado, what we have is a number of speakers, and then we have a lot of time at the end for conversation exchange. So we have a 10-minute presentation as an overview, and then 3 5-minute presentations from the regions. So without further ado, I will introduce Professor Alan Dale. Many of you know Alan. He's the Professor for Tropical Regional Development at the Cairns Institute at James Cook University. He's also the Chief Scientist for Cooperative Research Centre for Developing Northern Australia, and many other titles which will take too long. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Alan. Over to you, Alan.
Thanks, Harriet, and welcome everybody to this seminar. It's fantastic to see this event today. We've very much wanted to try to make sure that this was a seminar targeted to regional audiences, so it's great to see around about 90 people registered from right across Queensland regions, as well as a bit of a chance for us to talk through what's happening in all of our regions, tropical North Queensland, central Mackay regional sort of side as well as down at the University of Southern Queensland and the southwest. So it's fantastic to see everybody coming together for this conversation today. What I wanted to do really was probably to sort of set back some feedback from some series of fairly large but targeted decarbonisation workshops that we had in Cairns and Townsville in around about April of this year, and to give a bit of a feel for what we were hearing in those decarbonisation workshops about the priorities for research and development coming in behind our communities in this great challenge around decarbonising our economy. So I just wanted to sort of tease through some of the things that we were hearing coming through those things, and they're the sorts of issues that we'd really like to be able to take up, not just in James Cook University, Central Queensland Uni and University of Southern Queensland as part of the Regional Economies Centre of Excellence, but also tying that back in through the Decarbonisation Hub of Queensland, which is a new venture between the Department of Environment and Climate and the Queensland's 11 universities as well. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a feel for what we're hearing out of those seminars. This is a bit of a mechanism to feedback, but it's also the work that we'll be taking forward in terms of major agendas for research and development to support our communities in the decarbonisation challenge. I would just very quickly just remind people about the Decarbonisation Hub. It's a new venture between Queensland Government, 7 universities across Queensland and the Queensland Government. Around about 3 years ahead of it at this moment, and a relatively small startup, but University of Queensland is acting as the hub coordinator. One of the biggest themes in the hub is around community and regional transformations, and that's one of the reasons why this regional agenda of how we support our regions around decarbonisation is so important. My forgiveness in advance for people who may have heard little bits of this story before, but effectively what we wanted to do is use this little bit of a chance to feedback these sort of things that we were hearing. I think the key thing we were hearing right across our regions was that regional Queensland, and this is a very strong message we particularly want to give to Brisbane and Canberra, that regional Queensland is not necessarily against or opposed to a decarbonisation agenda. It's very much up for the challenge, but decarbonisation agendas really need to be able to deliver substantive benefit for regions as we travel through. If at the end of the hard haul of achieving Queensland's decarbonisation targets, if we're not as regions in a stronger position economically, socially, environmentally and culturally, then we wouldn't really have achieved better development or better development outcomes. So I think it's a challenge that regional Queensland puts up and puts on the table as saying that we're here for very much achieving decarbonised economy, but at the same time, we need to get better outcomes socially, economically and environmentally with relation to that. Some very common themes kept coming through both the Cairns workshops and the Townsville workshops, and I just wanted to tease those through together as best as we can. So the first and foremost one, which was coming up very consistently, was around workforce and workforce-related issues, and the fact that with the massive change that's happening in the vast, in all of our regions, both remote regions as well as on the coast, that we've got very big workforce challenges ahead of us, and a whole lot of issues that need to be done to sort of prepare for and to build that workforce in advance of the big investments that are going to come for decarbonisation going forward. So that issue of thinking across our regions collectively, as well as getting down to the specifics of the workforce needs of places like Cunnamulla, right through to Croydon or Cairns or Torres Strait, they're things that need to be sort of dealt with both at a place-based level, but also collectively across regional Queensland. And we've just come from the Developing Northern Australia Conference in Karratha this week, where the challenges we were hearing in relation to workforce and decarbonisation were very consistent as well. The second layer that was coming through that again probably is best dealt with across our state and across our regions collectively is around the challenge of supporting industry scale decarbonisation. So agriculture, for example, has many common challenges in decarbonisation right across the state, whether you're in the southwest or the northeast. There are very consistent issues that need to be dealt with in multiple sectors like tourism, but of course the mining sector and the petroleum sector and the critical minerals sector are also significant sectors where there needs to be some collective strategies. Queensland Government is working towards very explicit sector-based strategies on these issues, and the thing we want to try and drive is a university-wide approach, cross-university-wide approach to contributing to and supporting industry transitions in relation to these changes. Then we've got the reality of our individual regions and the challenges that regions face in relation to decarbonisation. And a lot of this comes down to regional planning, infrastructure planning and land use planning. So significantly, our regions were experiencing quite large conflicts over decarbonisation work that needs to happen, whether it's new solar or wind farm development, or whether it's preparing for really turbocharging generation and energy use across something like the new copper string sort of transmission lines between Mount Isa and Townsville as well. So in Townsville, copper string came through as a very strong agenda there, where we need to be thinking a lot more about regional planning for energy generation, making sure we're working with energy generators in places where there's great support and high social license. At the same time as really getting ourselves coordinated around impact assessment, and particularly the social and economic impacts coming out of major energy generation and transmission related developments. In places like the Western Wet Tropics, a lot of conflict over environment versus culture versus transmission and wind farm related developments. And again, a real need to see a much greater level of bioregional planning and integrated impact assessment related issues. So those they were the sorts of issues coming through very significantly. And this is probably at the start of where this conversation around the importance of traditional owner-led thinking about these issues at the landscape scale and the preparation of traditional owner communities to be both aware of and able to drive their own aspirations in relation to this energy transition, whether it's traditional owners leading their own energy equity-based arrangements, or at least making sure that they are that issues of traditional owner interest in new energy generation and or development is dealt with equitably and fairly. So those issues start coming in at the regional scale. Then at the community scale, a lot more conversations had coming through this debate about fundamentally supporting communities in particularly at the local government level, whether we might be talking, for example, about the Etheridge Shire in the Gulf, whether we might be talking about Rockhampton Regional Council or Townsville City Council. How do we support this conversation about decarbonisation at the community level? How do we support local government in particular to play a leadership role in respect to these transitions? And what are the jobs that need to be done at the community scale? So one of the things we've drawn on very heavily there is the experience we had in the Communities in Transition program, which was done between the state and around about 6 local governments across Queensland some 5 or 6 years back. Lots of lessons coming through around how to achieve that transition agenda. But then, of course, we're really hearing consistently, I suppose, some of these big issues about the fact that decarbonisation is not just a job done at those scales, but also done at the small to medium enterprise scale, the business level, and the household scale. So what support is needed to fundamentally enable these issues of decarbonisation of business level activity, circularisation of business level activity? What sort of research development support and transition support is needed at those scales? And that may scale up, for example, at neighbourhood scale or business industrial estate development scale as well. But lots of work that needs to be put into supporting things. So hopefully I just wanted to use that slide as a way of sort of setting up the discussion today, that the main message coming out of the workshops that we held in Townsville and Cairns were that our regions are up for the challenge. Every region is significantly different in terms of how it might want to deal with those challenges and the issues that they face. But there's also some common issues coming out right across the state, from the southwest right through to the northeast, around how these issues might be played through. So in wrapping up, Harriet, what I'd probably say is that taking these agenda forward, one of the things we're sort of doing at the moment is pulling all of this together into a decarb hub policy paper, so that we're working through these issues with the state government. But also we want to be able to support the state to be having these conversations with the Commonwealth in a way that lets us think through how the universities right across our state, but particularly for the University of Southern Queensland, Central Queensland University and James Cook University, who are out there as anchor institutions in the regions, how can we support our communities, our First Nations traditional owners, our local governments and our regions in this big challenge of achieving a decarbonised economy? So they're the processes we want to go forward with over the next bit of time. We'll work that through the Decarbonisation Hub. But I think, Harriet, also just to wrap up, it's one of the things I'm really keen to keep continued feedback from the members on this webinar today about the key priorities for taking these things forward. But I'll wrap up there and continue on. So I'm going to stop sharing in a second. And
thanks very
back to you,
much,
Harriet.
Alan. Yes, there's a lot there to be unpacked, and in 10 minutes, it's hard to cover it in detail, but you've given us a good overview. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Andrew Drysdale. Many of you will know Andrew. He's a recognised leader in natural resource management. He's a consultant, and he's also a research fellow at the University of Southern Queensland with Rural Economies Centre of Excellence. So over to you, Andrew, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Harriet. And I think giving me the title of a research fellow is way over more than what I am. So, but I would, and thanks, Alan, for providing some context to today's webinar. I would start by saying that I'm definitely, whilst I'm doing some work with University of Southern Queensland and part of a small research team led by Dr. Leela Singh Pedersen, who we're taking a deeper dive into the drivers for participation in environmental carbon market schemes and the impacts of those. That's still being rolled out and analysed, and Leela will release a paper, and that probably be more the, I suppose, a contribution from the uni. My contribution today is really based on being an ex-landholder in southwest Queensland and having family still out there, and also talking to producers around the state over the last several years through various workshops. So when Huri had asked me if I'd be interested in presenting today, my initial response was, look, I know little to nothing about decarbonisation, but I can talk about some of the challenges producers are facing when moving to be carbon neutral. And then when I reflected, I thought, well, really, they're probably one of the same, if not very similar. And that's an example, I think, of the challenges that producers are facing out there. When you look about it, we've got decarbonisation, we've got carbon neutral, we've got net zero, we've got carbon positive, we've got climate friendly, we've got circular economies, we've got renewables. All these terminologies are flying around out there and a whole lot more. And it's confusing. It is really confusing for producers. Like, I've been knocking around this space for quite a while and I still haven't got my head around them all. So I think for a start, in terms of helping, and I'm taking a perspective from producers here, I know there's industry and a whole lot of others that are a part of the whole decarbonisation, I call, challenge. I think we really need to be mindful when we use terminology to provide some definition to that terminology, particularly to people who don't live and breathe it. I acknowledge that moving to becoming carbon neutral requires both from producers, minimising their inputs such as energy, fuel, fertilisers, but also the opportunity to offset some of their emissions. And it's that latter part that I'm sort of commenting on, largely because my experience has been around that through the QRider type scheme as a carbon farming advisor and a few others, is around that space of carbon farming. I've probably over the last several years, I've observed out there in producer land in the early parts where they were looking at the whole carbon farming, mainly carbon farming at that stage. Environmental markets hardly even hit the field, with some scepticism and maybe a little more than a passing interest. And of course, there were a few out there who saw it was a great opportunity and jumped in there. What I'm observing now and hearing now is that they've moved from maybe the scepticism's still there, but they realise that they've really need to get in there and get a better understanding and how all this works. And coming back to what the universities can do, I think that's probably one of the biggest support mechanisms, areas of work that universities can help in. But producers are taking steps, as I understand, and talking to some to offset their emissions. But the understanding of what that really requires is very poor in some cases. I don't know. Well, I can't say it's the majority. I haven't analysed the stuff, but by way of example, I was having a chat to a fellow Western Queensland producer who's a big producer at a funeral, and he said to me, I think this carbon farming is all a load of crap, or words to that effect, probably a bit stronger. And he said, but I tell you what I'm already doing. I'm locking up paddocks of regrowth so that I'm banking my offsets. So when I need to offset my emissions, I've got that regrowth there. And I thought, oh my gosh, or words to that effect, that there's a whole lot in that. I mean, that gentleman hasn't benchmarked or established baselines to work from. For him, it was as simple as, I just need to lock up regrowth and it'll be there for me to call on. So when I raised this issue with the carbon project developer and their response, it was something along the lines of, it'd be better for that producer to sell those premium ACCUs credits and go and buy some cheaper credits from a from a source in Melbourne based around refuge, controlling emissions. And as I said, I've been knocking around this space for a while, and that was the first time I heard that. And so again, that's by way of an example of the complexities around this and the things that are happening. And we, and I use that collective term, we, universities and those around here, maybe from industry and the like, we need to do better in helping producers tread their way through these complexities. It's really as simple as that, from my perspective. I also think there's a real risk of over-promising and under-delivering. I can recall, Alan, you were around, we've been around for a while, but you were around in my space then, I think it was about the early 2000s leading into an election. And ACF had this, and I won't get it completely right, but they were saying leading into election, if we can increase the sequestration of carbon in the Australian rangelands by 5% over 40% of the rangelands, will sequester all the emissions that Australia emit. And that just lifted expectations. And then in the Rangelands Conference in Longreach, I think it was around about 2001, one of the focus of that conference was the opportunities for rangelands producers to around carbon and environmental markets. And of late, the whole push around increasing soil carbon. Now we've seen through the Rangelands Journal 2 articles released in the last 3 weeks where science are questioning the possibility of increasing organic carbon levels in rangeland soils through grazing regimes. And yet we have producers out there who think that's possible. And there are others, carbon developers, may well be, I'm no scientist. So I think we need to try and balance and put I don't know, reality is not the right word, but I think we need to try and balance the expectations, at least. Other challenges, and I know I'm talking about uptaking and sequestering carbon. Wherever you can sequester carbon, that gives you an opportunity to move to carbon neutral for an enterprise. Property size constantly raised in a series of LRF workshops. I co-facilitated LRF awareness. Again, it's easy to say that you can offset your emissions, but can you, particularly at a small level? Although it's probably easier to offset them than sell them if you're just banking them to offset your emissions. Just a personal thing, helping my brother set up a carbon and LRF project on his southwest Queensland property. And when he asked me to participate, whether he should go ahead and that, and I said, oh, it's a great opportunity, but don't be in a hurry. 2 years later, he's still trying to get that project bedded down. And to him and a lot of others that I speak to, his greatest fear of any of these markets is policy uncertainty, governments changing policy. So, Harriet, I'll leave it there. I've only touched on a couple examples of challenges, and for every challenge, there's an opportunity. I realise that in terms of moving to carbon neutral, both from entering market opportunities, but also reducing input costs. So there are a lot of opportunities out there. I'd urge people around here to keep an eye out for Leela's research paper. I think looking forward to that. That will paint a pretty interesting picture, I think. And also, I've got to jump off in 5 minutes. So if anyone's got any questions, please feed them through you and pass them on to me, and I'll do my best to answer those.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks for fitting this in. I know you have to go, so appreciate that you've provided the inputs. So we might move on to our next speaker. Many of you also know Professor John Rolfe, who's a Professor of Regional Economic Development at CQ University, and he's going to be talking about Central Queensland. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Harriet. I'll just share my screen if I can. Is that sharing, Harriet?
Yes, we can see it, John.
I'll put it in PowerPoint mode. That looks good.
Yes, we can also see the little slide next to it.
I'll swap it around. Does that fine?
That's it. Yes.
Very good. Thank you. Okay.
We're back on your email slide now.
Yeah, the computer did a funny thing. Okay. I'm going to talk about regional impacts and just focusing on the really big ones. I think this mirrors what Alan talked about before. The three big areas that regions need to pay attention to with decarbonisation is what are going to be the changes in employment, and there's a lot of gains and losses here, but the things to look for are the construction stages, the operational stages, and then the flow through effects into regional economies. The second big area is impacts on the cost of energy. So that affects particularly things like minerals processing, which are huge energy users, and other sectors in our economies. And the third big area that is challenging for regions is how to deal with the approval challenges and planning for new solar, wind and transmission projects. And this is, there's often a lot of pressure points in regional economies, getting acceptance for the new projects and dealing with some of the shortages of housing and labour. I'm going to focus on employment because that's the most topical at the moment issue, I think. And I'm going to focus on Central Queensland to give you a little bit of a picture of what the types of issues are. So just looking at the sectors that are most likely to be impacted by decarbonisation in rough order of impact, but you can argue that my ordering might be revised. Certainly one of them, the first one is electricity, the utility sector. So as we close coal-fired power stations, we're going to lose workforce. And in Queensland, that sector is 2.6% of our workforce, so fairly large. The second is mining. There's a lot of permutations here about what happens with mining. Will it just be the mines closed that's supplying domestic energy, or will it be all thermal coal potentially, or all coal and all coal and gas? The total size of our workforce in mining in Central Queensland, which is pretty well all for energy, is 8.4% of our workforce, so several thousand workers. We also have a really large manufacturing sector. Now, this is particularly alumina and other manufacturing at Gladstone, but also magnesite in Rockhampton. So big, heavy manufacturing that relies on enormous power input. So these areas are very sensitive to power. And it adds up to 7.2% of our workforce in Central Queensland. Agriculture, this group has high emissions, so it'll be affected by higher energy prices. But the real issues in agriculture are some of the other emissions, which is methane from livestock and nitrous oxide from fertiliser use. So you've got 4.7% of our workforce potentially may be affected. Construction is very sensitive to higher energy charges, so that's 8.7% of our workforce, and transport costs, of course, higher energy prices. So when you add these up, we've got 37% of our workforce in Central Queensland that is potentially at risk of decarbonisation, that are going to be impacted by decarbonisation. If you compare it to Brisbane, it's only 14.2%. So we're almost 3 times more exposed than an urban area. And so that's why this is so important to regions, that the workforce challenges are going to be sharper than they are in other areas. Now, it's not all negative. We're going to have a lot of new renewable energy projects. So these are 2 maps. Of the one on the left is the wind farms in central Queensland. So it's the Gladstone and Rockhampton in the south through to Mackay and Bowen in the north. And there's 100, so the one on the left, wind farms, there's 64 existing and new wind farms planned in Queensland, of which 1/3 of them are in central Queensland, so 20 out of the 64. The map on the right shows solar plants. So 132 existing and new solar plants planned in Queensland, of which 45 are in central Queensland, so roughly about 1/3. And the reason why there's such a concentration in central Queensland, there's a lot of larger scale projects in central Queensland, is that central Queensland produces over 50% of the electricity required in Queensland at the moment. So we've got power stations at Gladstone, Rockhampton and Billawheeler. And so they produce more than the half of the state's power, and so replacing them will require a lot of energy close by. Now, that's a little bit of a snapshot of what are some of the issues. Now, rubbing the film off the crystal ball here is actually really difficult, because this is a very dynamic space and it's really hard to predict exactly what's going to happen. So let's just take some of these issues in order. We've got over 50% of Queensland's energy capacity at the moment, about 54%. So understanding the timing and then what's going to happen with those workforces, very critical to understanding the impacts of coal plant closures. The new wind and solar plants, lots of construction, but they've got very small operational workforces. And the workforces are currently very mobile. So it's really unclear what the regional footprints are. The government is claiming that 75% of all these new generation jobs are going to be in regional Queensland. I think it's true that the plants are in regional Queensland, but the workforces, a lot of them are drive in, drive out and fly in, fly out. So where they're located is not necessarily in the regions where construction is happening. More work needs to be done to understand this. The restrictions on coal and gas, this is very unclear what will happen. So we've got about 40,000 jobs just in the coal industry in central Queensland, but not everybody is based here. The export demand is going to remain very strong for coal and gas for another 20 to 50 years. So it's only going to be if there's government intervention to slow down exports that there will be impacts on jobs. Manufacturing, construction and agriculture, these are very sensitive to energy prices as well as to regulatory imposts. So we are already seeing Rio Tinto invest strongly in renewable energy to help safeguard its manufacturing base in Gladstone, which is very welcome. But we have a lot of other manufacturing and construction sectors in the regions that I think are currently at a little bit of risk with government policy. And agriculture has a large greenhouse footprint in central Queensland. It's really essential to most of regional Queensland economies, but solutions are really elusive. So electric tractors are not the answer. The big issues in agriculture are methane from livestock, nitrous oxide from fertiliser use. And if you take in the land use sector as well, then we've got the extra emissions from land use change. So those are the big things with agriculture. Pretty difficult to deal with. Many of these, I could have added another dimension to this. Many of these issues, I think, will be also affected by new technologies. And so making assumptions about the penetration of new technologies into these different sectors also is needed to be able to come up with some viable scenarios. I'll leave it at that, Harriet, in the interest of time. And
thank you so much, John. And certainly you're raising some fundamental issues around workforce across sectors, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of comments around that as when we open it up. Let us have our final speaker. I'd like to introduce Wade Chiesa, who is the CEO of RDA Northwest, based out of Townsville. Over to you, Wade.
Thanks, Harriet. Just make sure everyone can see that. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep, you're good. You're good. We can see the slide and we can see
Awesome.
you, hear you.
Thanks, everybody. Today I'm just going to talk about some of the impacts as to what's happening in Townsville, Northwest Queensland, which includes the corridor between Townsville, Mount Isa and up to the Gulf of Carpentaria. Obviously, the big component there is copper string. I want to talk a little bit about the global trends and the local impacts and the policy alignment between state and federal government, which what we're seeing is a confluence of major public sector investment in infrastructure added to major public sector investment in services, and then off the back of that, private sector investment in both services and in infrastructure, which is creating a significant construction project pipeline. And whether it's 27 billion or 33 billion or whatever the number is, it's significant. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And that's causing some unintended consequences in relation to significant cost escalations and some social impacts in and around the corridor. So I'll get started. As I said, we're uniquely placed to take advantage of the global economy. The key drivers, I'm sure most people on this call, I won't go into it significantly, but you're all aware of the what's happening globally in relation to energy transition, critical mineral demand, the focus more on national security, diversification. In our region, the push on tropical knowledge, innovation and health, and that increase in sovereign capability and that made in Australia, or the federal government's new policy, future made in Australia. So where are we at currently? As I said, the current government policy, major projects. Now, we've done a study on a major projects analysis. There's lots of major project reports out there, but we've modelled it using a CGE model to look at a competition on labour. We've spoken to proponents. We've got a real good understanding. And what we did is we modelled it on the number based on what the proponents told us of around the $27 billion mark. Interesting to note, 30% of that number is actually committed to and locked in and ready to go. So we modelled what they've told us, and we modelled a really conservative number to understand what the themes and messages are. And the themes are exactly the same. So it's, in my mind, it's less about the number and more about what are the impacts. And as has already been touched on, workforce is a major issue. As I said there, 10 years ago, we needed projects for jobs. Now we need the 3 Ps. What are they? People to deliver the projects, a place for them to live, and then we've got to consider providing the services that they expect to live in these regional communities, which leads me to my second sort of square there. There's no silver bullet. It needs to be a multifaceted approach with multiple stakeholders. And I think now the focus really needs to be on coordination, prioritisation and alignment, because even as of late of last week, we attended the MITES Infrastructure Forum, and a lot of the councils along the corridor presented on similar type themes, and that housing, the need for those services and infrastructure in the region. We know there's significant upgrades to these roads to enable these wind farms, these solar farms that the state are working on at the moment. So, which leads to, obviously significant opportunities. If we get this right, we can supply in this region, the globe and nation, for energy or critical minerals and agriculture. So the opportunities are there. but we've got some challenges that we need to progress. Some of the things we're working on at the moment is we've done the Northwest Queensland ROC have done an enabling infrastructure review. We're going to incorporate a lot of these things in our strategic regional plan to try and get some, prioritisation and coordination in relation to that. We've looked at a workforce scan based on the construction pipeline analysis that we've done, which will help us lead to a workforce development plan. We've mapped all the different players in the workforce space, and it's such a busy space. And I guess the message is there's a lot of people out there doing a lot of good stuff, but it just needs that coordination level to go over the top of it. So I'll leave that there. Happy to answer any questions, but I think the main message is significant pipeline, which is being driven by predominantly energy type projects, around 60% odd. 21 is mining and heavy industry. 38% of those projects are from the public sector, from government type projects, which is leading to a significant demand for workforce. And some of those smaller communities out there, they are racing to be ready for this. And I would argue, and this is not based on it, this is my anecdotal discussions with them, that they're not quite ready for what's to come, which needs to be a focus. So these smaller towns, we don't boom and bust them. And then the last thing, I think there's a need for this region to probably consider the bioenergy, or what can be done from a bioenergy sort of standpoint. It seems to have been sort of missed, and I think that can be we're seeing significant movement in sustainable aviation fuel, and I think given what we've got in our radius in terms of sugarcane production, that needs to be thrown into the discussion. Thanks, Harry.
Great, thank you, Wade. And that's 3 different regional presentations that have given snapshots of how decarbonisation is impacting the regions differently and in some similar ways with Alan's overview. Now it's time to open it up for questions, comments, share what's happening in your region, ask questions, outline and identify where are the critical gaps. Where do you think are the next steps? What are the policy issues? So over to a rich discussion. Is there anyone who would like to get the ball rolling? If you could raise your hand. I've got Gareth.
I'm just going to move you to the different screen because I'm looking sideways. Thank you very much, everyone. There's very interesting topics here. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm the CEO of AMTO, which is the peak industry body for marine tourism. So representing all the marine park tourism in the Great Barrier Reef, island resorts, and everything in between from small boats upwards. I take a lot of comfort listening to the other speakers and presenters today, because the marine industry has been looking at decarbonising. I've now found out back to 2006 and seeing the same challenges across different sectors. It sounds a bit weird, but it is a bit reassuring that the challenges that we're trying to face for ourselves are not unique. And so, but where we finding it more of a challenge recently, where we've actually got proposals in with state and federal government, particularly for our sector, that aligns with both government's commitments and policies, where it's actually stated in policies, that they get distracted by almost a higher level problem rather than what are actual the solutions. And the first presenter, Andrew Drysdale, was saying that complexity is very significant for our industry. And what it does, it actually gives our guests and the public the wrong expectations of what is actually achievable. And that actually has a reputational damage to industries too. So, and I'm seeing that also as a running theme throughout the presentations today, like through workforce, what is achievable. And I think we need to actually acknowledge that, because if I had to get a phone call or an email every week saying why we haven't electrified our fleet and how dare we be environmentally negative to it's not fair for us from that. And it's the same with multiple industries, and we're all trying to do the best thing. One of the things I have seen is that this space is very, very siloed. So it's great to have these hubs and collections. There's about 15 or 20 of these, that I sit on and talk to. And so it's a way of how do we all come together, because there's a risk of governments getting distracted and going down the easiest path for them rather than what's actually the real result that we're all trying to find out. So it's more of a statement than a question, and I'll put it to the group because there's better brains on this panel than I have. So, that's where I just wanted to kind of say we've got to be careful not to confuse the space. Try to bring the siloedness together, and then also that realistic expectations, because when it comes to sectors, and I can imagine farming is very similar, our industry is similar. Why aren't you both hydrogen? Well, because it's illegal. And when we're trying to find a solution, we're finding governments, even though we're a peak industry body, governments don't want to listen to the small industry bodies. They want to have the big high level stuff, which is often worrying that they're going to come out with solutions that aren't fit for purpose for specific industries. So in this planning, we've got to, and that's why I liked yours, Alan, where you've got the circles coming down to those industries. There has to be a focus on the bigger strategic plans, but how are we going to tackle the specific industry's needs to make it fit for purpose, to manage expectations, reduce complexities, and most importantly, actually make the transition work, because that's what we all want to do. Yeah.
Thanks, Gareth. I'll throw it to Wade and then Alan.
Thanks, Harriet. I think someone had their hand up before me. Was that Amy? Did you have your? I think. Oh
no, Tracy and Amy have got questions. But were you trying to respond to Gareth?
Yeah, but okay. I'm happy to do it. I think that's an excellent point. What you've said, and I think that what is achievable is really important. And I think that some of the problem with it too is that it's become over the last decade plus 2 decades overly politicized. So we've got one extreme to the other. Whereas I think what we've got to start the conversation is what is achievable. And you're right, hydrogen trucks, so the technology's not quite there. So we're going to have to, because we pulled B triples to make it efficient to transport, our produce and things across this vast land. So I do absolutely agree with you. The risk too in this region with having such a significant high pipeline is that wages and costs start to escalate, that all of a sudden things just start to drop out and the private proponents just walk away, so you don't have anything. So I think a measured discussion, and a realistic approach needs to be driven that ignores the politics of it.
Alan, over to you. And Alan, if you also want to comment from a policy perspective as well.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate Gareth's comment, because it's one of the reasons we really pulled those workshops together earlier this year, Gareth, so that we start to actually get a regional voice in that conversation. And I think where we're wanting to go forward from here is really working across our universities in Queensland, but particularly the 3 regional ones, together with the state, together with the Commonwealth, about trying to get a bit of structured coordination in the research and development ask there. And the last part I would say there is the big focus to date has been about the generation, the wind farms and the solar and the transmission, which, as we all know, is only part of the story. The great initiative you guys are trying to do as an industry are very much just as big a part of the decarbonisation journey as are the poles, wires and, the generation products. So it's time for us to start thinking about those issues. But back to other questions, Harriet.
Yeah, Tracy, you're next, and then followed by Amy.
Thank you so much. I think it's a fabulous forum, and I'm very pleased to be part of this. I think just picking up on a couple of points there, particularly what Andrew was saying, and we're finding this, so I'm from the Clean Energy Council, the communication for people about just the complexity of all of this is really, and it hits a little bit on what Gareth was saying too. I think we do need really very simple communication for people so that they can understand how this is all happening. But my question was for Professor Rolfe. You mentioned that export for coal and gas will be strong for the next 20 years, so it would really only be government intervention that would change that. Can you talk to me a little bit about where you see that? How is that the case? where is that 20-year demand for coal and gas going to come from?
So that's going to come from overseas countries. That's part of the growth prospects, particularly for East and Southern Asia. So countries like India, Indonesia, big populations, growing wealth, and their growth in energy demand is going to be huge.
So you're not seeing that transition to renewables, that they will still rely on coal and gas?
They'll still rely on coal and gas. Renewables have a huge upfront cost. So, rich countries can afford them. The developing countries can't afford them as easily. And if you look at the predictions, the global predictions for energy demand, they will increase for several decades.
It's I mean, I guess it is a concern when we think about, we're going into an election in Queensland particularly, and then further down the track a federal election. Depending on where the government sits on all of this, it can certainly, and we were talking about trying to keep consistent policy around things, it can get very tricky, because that's obviously attractive to remain in those industries while there's demand. And I can see how it's just going to be a challenge to get consistency around policy. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Tracy. Amy?
Sorry, I'll just turn everything on. Yeah, thank you. This is my first foray into this forum, so I really appreciate the opportunity. So AMEC, we are exploration and mining, and the majority of our member base is the critical mineral guys, so vanadium, copper. We do obviously have some gold members and whatnot, but we're quite heavily involved in a lot of what's happening in the Northwest Minerals Province and a lot of stuff across policy. So I do second what a lot of people are saying consistently across Queensland, that the policy space needs to be consistent. If I were to take a step back and look at what QRDIP originally aimed to achieve and some of the forums that we attended there, and we talked a lot about coexistence, and we talked about a lot of, transitional of existing infrastructure, and where we see a departure from that is where some of the development around renewables hasn't potentially taken advantage of some of those footprints. And I know that there is obviously significant timing there between decommissioning of older industry versus new. But, that was quite a big policy framework set out to say that, where are those opportunities? And we might have not quite aligned in this political session, which we're about to possibly transition or change towards the end of this year. But I agree that, there is some very high-level strategic stuff that I think we could find some advantage for at that point. So I did want to ask how much involvement maybe the different groups, when you were talking as presenters collectively, you've had with Coexistence Queensland, and some of those. You may have, again, I said, this is my first foray into the group, but, when I look at a lot of the information that we feed back through on a policy space, I just wondered, how much feedback you might have been able to collect, or if you haven't touched base with them, they could be an excellent party to connect with, because they are collecting a lot of this information around exactly what you're talking about, some of those challenges in the transition of markets and those direct landholder challenges that we're seeing, and some of those resistance. For myself, I'm based in Thangool in central Queensland, so I'm essentially quite central to what's going on, and as well as obviously having connections statewide. And, I do look at some of the rhetoric that we're hearing, and so I think that, there's some real value in, maybe trying to get some of those connections and information flow between what different works are happening. So yeah, probably more open-ended statements, but yeah, I think this is, as you said, I'm all for the principle of getting as much information into communities as we can. Education is power, and it's the only way we're going to give people the tools to really understand what the future is going to look like. Policy, if it can be clearer to the lay person, as well as demonstrating what the outcomes are going to be. And yeah, I think, the only thing I might slightly disagree with on John indicated that he thought employment was one of the most critical issues. I think one of the things that I hear a lot about is approval pathways, and that's and not as in an disagreeing, just more that the approval pathway space for renewables is very different to what we see for mining, and there's obviously a lot of when you have a framework that's largely been known and well worked for a long time in Queensland, and then you have a new framework coming in, it can be hard for a lot of different community representatives to know, well, why do they get to do it that way and we have to do it this way? So, yeah.
I fully agree, Amy. I could have talked for another separate 5 minutes and not repeated a single word.
Yeah. So I think that's that's all.
Alan, you want to respond?
Yeah, thanks, Harriet, and thanks, Amy. If John could talk for half an hour about that one, I'd talk for about 10 hours on the planning and approval pathways one. It's a lot of work being done by CRC Northern Australia, as Matt DeLargan knows over at NAIF, around particularly these issues of how do we strengthen up our planning and development assessment systems in Queensland, and particularly given the challenges moving forward. I actually see, and I sort of did mention in the context of what we were hearing at our Cairns and Townsville sessions, that the issue of getting the regional planning foundations right, so that we're actually in a much better position to target our efforts where there's the lowest risk to the environment, greatest environmental and social benefit, where there's a high possibility of getting very strong social license to drive these things forward, as well as, empowering traditional owners to be part of that debate about where they sort of sit in that story. That's a crucial issue if we're going to go forward at all, because of potential loss of social license and the risk of political divide because of that. But then within that is the whole issue of actual development approval processes beyond that. So I just going to flag my very significant personal interest in this, because I was actually the first regulator of social impact in Queensland. And that was in the early days of the gas field developments, or gas sort of period. So we, to a certain extent, have been here before in Queensland. And what happened was the emergence of the Gas Field Commissioner arrangement out of that.
Yeah, well.
So Warwick and I, just on your first question, Warwick and I caught up very briefly the other day, and we'll be talking a lot more. But through this work, we've had a lot of input into the RES development strategy. We've worked really closely with DEC, and there's a very strong link between DEC and the hub as a whole. So, part of the value of these sessions is to keep that regional voice and to keep throwing in, and industry, is obviously a very strong part of that regional voice from my point of view. So, there's strong mechanisms up into there. But as I think Wade's talk very significantly contributed to this as well, about how the biggest crisis that we're facing in the Northwest is coordination and development coordination effectively, so that we're managing the social economic sort of issues that are coming through in housing, development assessment, and those sorts of issues. And we're closely linked into the development coordination arrangements that have been run through state development that James is running from State Development in Townsville. So I've got a meeting with James around that next week. We've been meeting with the Office of Critical Minerals around some of these issues. It's great to have these voices, I think, Amy, so that we can feed up into those processes and get some influence.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think I didn't want to probably overload my commentary with that, but it's interesting when you say about that first SIA back in the day. That was when I was a cadet town planner, and we started off, and I went to one of the first sessions for that. So thank you. I think that was out at Emerald. We ran that one.
Oh, that's right.
So that was a little, that was a good memory shot. The other part for regional plans, which I don't want to overload for this, but it's something that worth maybe, which I see a little bit in the work we do with the federal space, is how regional plans under the NPP are eventually maybe going to filter down. It might not be as direct for what you're looking at, but it's something we really strongly keep an eye on around how the NPP roll out and what kind of layer that is then going to have over the top of what we're already seeing. So,
yeah, thank you, Amy. Mark.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for the talk so far. Mine's a bit of a question around definitions and just getting some clarity on what people think about it in terms of sequestration. and what the definition people are using. I see a lot of proposals going around where the carbon sequestration is more fixation and a bit more transient than actual, 100 years stored away for 100 years. And I'm just wondering what people are considering a realistic carbon sequestration value in terms of time sequestered. It's a bit of a broad question, but just interested going forward if there's any comments on that.
Well, to begin with,
John and Alan, yeah.
If we look at the soil carbon stuff and the vegetation carbon stuff, it's 25 years through to 100 years, Mark, and some people would argue that 25 years isn't enough, but it's going to be very difficult to get actions out of agriculture for anything longer than that. 25 years is already more than one generation when you're talking about farming families. So that's really difficult to make those sort of commitments at a very broad scale. Yeah, so I think that that's the policy settings. I don't see huge pressure to change at this stage away from that range of years.
Alan, did you want to add anything, or Wade?
Yeah, probably just one of the big areas that we didn't get into a lot of depth. Andrew touched on a little bit in his story in terms of the farming sector contribution. But one of the biggest areas coming through both in Cairns and Townsville's workshop was really obviously the huge role that the regions have got to play in, the sequestration sort of story. And that in itself is going to take a whole lot of landscape scale thinking about where, how, what's the best way to do it. But it reminds us that Australia has at least in the last 20 years in the lead up to this step taken some reasonable steps to get a reasonably cohesive landscape scale, framework for ACCUs to come into place, Australian carbon credit units. A lot of work to continue to improve the integrity of that. And that is a big part of the Decarb Hub and Theme 2 in particular. People like Felicity Dean and others will be leading a lot of work around that space. But I appreciate you chipping in, Mark, because obviously blue carbon in particular is one of those big and emerging areas. But Australia can be reasonably proud, I think, of having a quite flexible outcomes-based arrangement, whereas when it first was debated, let's say around about the early 2020s, we were talking about monocultures through the old CPRS. To see that shift into the carbon farming initiative and to see it shift into a quite mature system, one that still has a lot of work to be done to make it as integral, high integrity as possible. But I think Queensland's probably got one of its biggest opportunities is actually in the blue carbon space. And it's great to see some of the research and development work you're doing that's going to contribute to that.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, it's great to have those values as well, and just understand that, because it's going forward with some of the things that we're developing. It's nice to know that that's the range that we're looking at. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
We've got Andrew, but just before Andrew asks his questions or comments, we have a comment in the chat from Ramdas. He says, clearly renewables are the way to go forward, but land use, particularly farming land, provides challenges and conflicts. So if the panel could think about that while we go to Andrew. Andrew, over to you. Andrew Cronin, are you there?
Sorry, he lowered his hand and I can't see him.
He's gone. Okay. So, Ramdas, what was your question getting at? Did you want to ask it in person?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity. It's a great forum. Yeah, you all. I think most of you agree that I think the renewables are the way forward to meet our decarbonization targets, and particularly for our regional communities. Okay, in that space, I just want that we have. I think John has showed the details of what is our plan, actually, where are the new renewable energy plants are being located, and there is a great projects in the area of wind energy and solar, and also pumped hydro. in that space, actually, these are all actually causing, I mean, particularly the large land usage. I think he has already highlighted that actually, and also which is actually going negative as far as our decarbonization targets are there. But so how do we, what are the ways, can you just think about what are the ways we can, but most of the time, you know, there are these installations actually causing problems for the, agriculture as well as the, associated industries. And so is there any way we can collocate both of them, having agriculture actually and also having renewable energy production? Can you please share your thoughts on this?
Sure. Well,
Alan? Yeah, John?
Yeah, I think there's this is a space, I think, where it's actually really difficult to, there's a lot of pressures. There's some people who are quite happy, some landholders who are quite happy, others who are upset. Essentially, the three big issues are competing for good agricultural land. So some of the siting of renewable energy projects hasn't been wonderful. The solar farm at Emerald on some of the better soils around Emerald, when you go 10 kilometres further west and very poor production land could have been used. The second issue is the biodiversity impacts. So I think there's starting to be more attention to this. There's a lot of concern in agriculture that farmers aren't allowed to clear trees, but the green energy projects are given open slather. So there's that perception out there, and there doesn't seem to be any clear way of summarising what the environmental approval processes are for the renewable energy projects. It certainly seems to be easier for renewable energy projects than for mining at the moment. And I think the third area that the Queensland government doesn't handle well are the lifestyle impacts. So for instance, mining projects or mining exploration is allowed wherever you are, apart from in an urban area. So there's mining exploration going on right around Bundaberg for coal at the moment, and huge potential impacts on lots of small landholders. But if you look at the legislation, there is basically no way of taking account of the lifestyle impacts of these type of projects. So we don't account for small landholders. Mining companies usually don't touch areas for small landholders because it's too complicated, but there's nothing legislatively or regulatory that really stops them. And we're starting, when it comes to transmission lines, the lifestyle impacts are the ones that are hurting. And the government's very unprepared for this because it's not something that they've thought about before. So I think we've got a lot bigger challenges to come. I think it will take some really active work by government to negotiate through this. And I think that the pace of development in renewables is going to be much slower than they anticipate, because I'm hearing a lot of feedback from regional areas that people aren't happy.
Thanks, John. Alan? You're on mute, Alan.
I said I'll be quick because we're running out of time. I can see Stephen Ung's got his hand up
got
for question
Steve.
as well. So
Yeah.
keen to hear from Steve. Very quickly, Ram, I just totally reinforcing John's point about this is one of the reasons we're saying the regional planning stuff's very crucial at this stage, because it starts to direct us to those parts of the landscape where there's going to be less conflict and greater outcome in terms of resource and input into the transmission system. But the quality of social impact assessment needs to be lifted fundamentally as well. So, and that really gets to the heart of how do we engage deeply in our communities. If the planning is done well, there should be a better receptive environment to renewables in the locations where it's going to occur. But if we get the project by project social impact and engagement right, then that takes a lot of the conflicted nature, or manages the conflict within communities much more effectively, much more equitably, and particularly positions the role of all of the key players, landholders, traditional owners, at the heart of the start of the project as opposed to right at the end. So Richard Houlihan at the Townsville conference put a very clear message, which I think needs to be repeated here, and it holds for all communities, but particularly traditional owners. Start with us, don't come at the end of the process in terms of major project approvals. But I did want to just sort of talk about quickly, I think, really the opportunity for Queensland, for all of our regions, Cairns, Townsville, Mackay, Rockhampton and beyond, right down into the southwest. How do we really do research and development that turbocharges the quality of generation we're getting and lifts productivity in the farming and production sectors? Now, we're looking at a bit of work, Wade, on the back of the Townsville one, particularly around how we can really turbocharge around the copper string agenda with a much greater sort of level of thinking about how pastoral production and solar might actually go together and lift productivity as well as generation. How do we do really high intensity agriculture around places like Pentland and others where we're talking about high value crops, but feeding quite significant energy back into the system? How do we actually see solar play a role, for example, in aquaculture and increasingly link that together? And then finally, how do we see bioenergy and sugar sort of tie together much more effectively? So it's about lifting the quality and depth of the economy at the same time as seeing win-wins in that system. But I want it there. I think it's the second layer below the planning, but I'm really keen to get Steve's question.
Yes, and well, just before we go to Steve's question, there are still about 50 people online and we haven't heard from everyone. Please feel free to put things in the chat about whether we've missed anything, whether there are gaps, whether there are priority issues we should focus on. So I invite you to put some things in the chat as we go to Steve. Steve, to you.
Thanks, Harriet. So Stephen Ung, I'm the Director for Major Projects with State Government's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships Department. It goes to the question around approvals that have been spoken about by Amy and John and Alan. And from the renewable energy zone assessment processes that are currently being undertaken by the government, my role within that has been to examine that First Nations engagement component. And so far from what I've seen, there has been in the short term that these assessments have been undertaken, a real reliance on the database information that's available. And so as a result, it tends to break down First Nations interests down to locations where there have been artifacts identified or potentially story places which have had significant cultural value. What it misses, and what my feedback to the deck guys have been, is that the landscape scale of cultural value has not been evaluated. And we can, as an environmental engineer in my past history, I understand all the science associated at the landscape scale. That makes it very easy for development to do conceptual design all the way through to planning approvals component and work through feasibility and where the risks are for a development and an investor. What we don't have are tools available for First Nations people that enables them to maintain their data sovereignty, but also allows for easy interaction with potential proponents to be able to engage upfront, engage quickly, but also have a better idea of what the landscape scale that these size of projects are likely to interact with. So that is an area that I think from a university's perspective, we don't have sufficient information for. Secondly, and that's not to scare that there's First Nations issues that need to be resolved, similarly to us having environmental issues. But there are also opportunities around, as you said, First Nations social license opportunities with that interaction, whether it be at the equity ownership scale or whether it be opportunities where mine closures will result in the ability to activate lands that may not have been thought about for particular purposes, which may be of higher value than previously thought about. Where is the knowledge and where is the education piece being developed around that to enable First Nations custodians to be able to understand how to engage with investors who are looking to work within these renewable energy zones under a whole variety of constraints that are overlaid in the approvals process to be able to get best bang for buck for lands that have been degraded, that may present the best opportunity for them and for the surrounding community, broader community, to benefit from them and mark as a contribution into the energy transformation.
Thank you, Stephen. You've raised a lot of issues. I was going to mention traditional owners and Indigenous rights in the decarbonisation agenda and just transitions, as we keep saying. How do we transition in a fair and inclusive way? So, Alan, you've got your hand up to respond to this.
Thanks, Harriet, and thanks, Steve. I think, this is one of the reasons the regional planning story is so crucial, because it's that landscape scale conversation that's essential to be really engaging with traditional owner interest across that landscape scale cultural story. And it's one of the reasons why we're getting into trouble at project scale. It's because it's not fitting into that landscape scale context. But it also is the start of the journey about where people have a real interest. So let's say there's 20 mobs across a particular region who 5 or 6 may have very strong ambitions around playing in the energy space. And that starts to help us think about, well, there's real opportunities there in empowering those groups to be thinking about, from the foundations of their aspirations about nation building, how they might be big players in that space as well. The second layer, I think that we really need to be getting a stronger level of integration here of, is the regional planning under the state legislation with the REZ framework, which is now moving into a res readiness sort of phase, together with the EPBC's regional planning, bio-regional planning sort of arrangements. So there's 3 bits of work that we actually need to get integrated that, if we're investing well, sort of set the scene right. The second layer does drop into the impact assessment side, as you're suggesting, which for me should not be about a static approach of looking at cultural heritage issues. It should be, what's the relationship between the proponent and the receiving community? And in that receiving community, the traditional owner is obviously a very high priority player. And how do they build a relationship with those emerging traditional owner institutions to absolutely get that right? And I want to put on the table also the importance of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander councils in Queensland, very different for other parts of Northern Australia. And the fact that those councils themselves are on seeking a journey, in terms of how they may contribute. And Steve, as you know, you were part of that session 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, where that's started to spark that conversation around what are the opportunities for the 17 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander councils to be playing in the decarb space. So all big agendas, but I actually think we need to be investing in the capacity both of councils and of the traditional owner institutions to be starting to say, well, what are our aspirations in this space, and what can we contribute, and where can we see equity and other opportunities emerging from that.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks, Stephen, for that question. We're coming up to our time. We were due to finish 5 minutes ago, but there's been some very good conversation. This is the beginning of the journey. The Decarbonisation Hub has many years ahead of it. I've put the web link to the hub in the chat, so keep following our activities.